Good morning, and thank you so much for listening to my recap on the two short stories, The Necklace and A Good Man is Hard to Find. I've given all of you some fantastic um, encouragement for your writing for the translation of The Necklace. You did a really nice job comparing the French to the two various translations by Boyd and Laurie. That was really exciting to see you working with those and considering the choices that were made between the two. I'm also working through your A Good Man is Hard to Find Google site posts where you recorded yourself speaking about the particular passages that you've chosen. And I thank you again for those. I will be working through those as quickly as possible to get you some personalized feedback in the meantime. But I wanted to welcome you to Unit 5, where we're going to be thinking specifically about character this week, thinking about Alice Walker's everyday use. And so I'm really excited about characterization. We've been thinking about setting, we've been thinking about plot and theme, but we haven't really focused too closely or too directly on character, although we have discussed lots about the characters in our short stories up until this point. A brief snippet about character and characterization. If you're like most people, plot is what keeps you going when you first read a story, and character is what stays with you after you have finished reading it. The protagonist is a word you'll often hear in literary studies. A protagonist is the central character in the story. The antagonist is often the person that is opposing the protagonist. In some ways, it mirrors sort of opposing views of the protagonist. Now, characters themselves are usually the people who are involved in what happens in the story, of course. Writers can use animals as characters or giant insects if you've ever read Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis. But the term character usually refers to a human being with emotions whose mind works something like our own. Characters themselves don't always have a conscious awareness of why they act the way they do, or if they have an awareness, it isn't always accurate. Yet there are always reasons, and the reader may discover them before the characters do. So keep that in mind as we're discovering these characters here. Point of view, who's telling the story, often helps us understand what these characters are thinking and feeling. The reader instinctively wants to connect the events of a story by more than their simple chronological sequence. Assuming a relation between the events and the characters makes the story seem coherent. So there are a few different ways to discuss characters. You can call them flat or round, static or dynamic. For characters to merge as round, think about them as dimensional. The reader must feel the play and pull of their actions and responses to situations. A flat character is more of like a placeholder. We're told their names, but we don't see them change during the narrative. And so I would characterize Flannery O'Connor's people as very much round, dynamic characters, especially the grandmother. How are the characters in a short story to be understood? Any discussion of character tends to drift into a value judgment, as our principles of definition and evaluation for fictional characters are based on the ones we use for real people, tentative and unfocused as they may be. We must remember that we're reading about fictional characters in a short story, not real ones. The only evidence we have about characters is what the author puts into the story, of course. We're on firmer ground in literary discussions when we analyze the writer's method of characterization, as well as the character's personality. In all successful fiction, the characters come alive as individuals. They must materialize on the page through the accumulation of details about their appearances, their actions, and responses as seen, heard, and felt by physical realities. Each writer of short fiction puts his or her own emphasis on character, and different fictional worlds make different demands on the reader's imagination. What's the most important to the reader's enjoyment of the tale is the emotional truth conveyed by the characters. Again, something Flannery O'Connor does really well. Whether they are flat or round, dynamic or static, to avoid sentimentality or this emotional overindulgence and stereotyping, the oversimplified judgment in creating characters, a writer must be able to suggest enough complexity to engage the reader's emotions, or the story will not succeed. This week I have a really exciting short story for you to read called Everyday Use by Alice Walker, who you might recognize as the author of The Color Purple. She's sort of best known for that author, or that book that was written in 1982. She was actually the first Black woman to win the Pulitzer Prize for this book. But you know, Alice Walker's first a poet, and so I think it's really interesting in this short story how she develops the characters in everyday use. So much so that they've actually transformed this particular short story into a film by the same name. This week I have you working on collaborative reading, but I have a set of vocabulary that might be helpful here, both to thinking about direct characterization and indirect characterization. So direct characterization is when the author clearly states a character's main personality traits. So there's no intuition there. It's just blatant on the page. Indirect characterization is when the author presents the character and allows the reader to draw conclusions about the character's personality based on their actions, thoughts, speech, and appearance. And so there's a little bit of a difference. So one's inferred and one's sort of on the surface. And so this week, I'd like you to read through the short story by clicking here on this shared Google document and respond to one of these questions in our collaborative reading document. Please don't replicate someone else's answer. I'd really like you to respond to a shared question by citing your answer in a different place in the story. So there's only 4 questions. Of course, you'll be answering a question that someone else has answered somewhere else, but find a new place in the short story to locate and orient the evidence for that particular question. The questions are, what impact does the author's use of point of view, like the perspective of the characters, have on the reader's understanding of and reaction to each character? You may choose to apply this response to Mama, Maggie, or Dee, the 3 characters in the short story. How does Dee think one's value or appreciation of heritage or culture should be demonstrated? And how does Maggie? They're very different views. Analyze the significance of the story's title. That's something that we did for A Good Man is Hard to Find. And then also another question is, what does this story have to say about heritage or culture overall? So again, there's a strong sense of heritage in this particular short story, and so there's 2 questions that kind of respond to that. But again, you're supposed to select one of these questions to respond to locate in our text for this week. Again, please add more comments in as you choose reactions or responses to what you're reading. I really appreciate reading those, but you only have to include 1 comment this week and 1 peer reply. Again, always feel free to add more. I'd also like you to watch the short video in Alice Walker's archives. I think that it kind of outlines some of the work that she's done really well, and it also shows what people are currently doing, what kinds of research they're doing on Alice Walker, and how to find some of these resources online. I'm disappointed that the Emory University archive for Alice Walker, it's sort of still in process in terms of digitization, so you actually have to go to the school to review some of her photographs and memorabilia, journals, articles, drafts, but eventually they will be digitized. But as you watch this video, please include 1 quotation from this short interview on your Google Site Unit 5 page. Anywhere you wish. It doesn't have to be in a specific spot, but I just want a note that you did watch this short video and that you included 1 choice quotation from your experience watching it. Again, I think it's only between 5 and 8 minutes long. This week for your terms and concepts, it's going to look a little different. I'm going to have you thinking about characterization, but as you open this slide deck, you'll notice that you don't actually have to build out your own slide. I'm rather going to have you work from the section in character. I'm going to have you work on characterization by clicking on contributing to the Google document by clicking here. You have to maybe click Control and click the cursor to get access to this Google Doc. Once here, you'll see that I want you to just share a character analysis. Identify 1 dominant character trait of that character. Provide evidence for that dominant character trait in both the direct and indirect characterization columns. Don't forget to include your name next to your contribution. So for example, I want you to select 1 character in this short story that you've enjoyed learning about and seeing develop. And I'd like you to include a character trait for that particular character on the left here. 1 dominant character trait. It might be envy, for example, in Mathilde's example. So using 1 specific word to describe what that character is or does, the dominant character trait. So remember to include your name here, include the dominant character trait here, and then I'd like you to include either an example of direct characterization, where the story itself talks about that particular trait, or indirect characterization, where we understand about that sort of dominant character trait, but not exactly expressed by the character herself, but rather through the sort of character personality based on the action, speech, or thoughts, appearances, or reactions to the character. Okay, so just 1 of these 2 columns, either direct or indirect evidence of that particular dominant character trait. And so I think that'll be really interesting. We can kind of compile and identify how round and dynamic each of these characters are. Please have your investigation into characterization in the slide deck done by Wednesday. I appreciate that. And then finally, I'm really excited about having you build out a page this week on characterization. And I think what's kind of appropriate is that Alice Walker's had so many of her works adapted to film. I'd like you to think about what goes into maybe the characterization and the casting of a particular character. So this week, I'd like you to build out a Unit 5 characterization Google site page. On this page, include one quotation from the Alice Walker interview above that I mentioned, anywhere you want. But then I'd like you to focus on casting. So Walker's The Color Purple and Everyday Use have both been adapted for film. In an effort at thinking about how characterization impacts casting decisions, I would like you to include a picture of and explanation for your decision to cast a major character, any you wish, for the role of Mama, Maggie, or Dee. So just select one of them. In your casting, describe why your particular actor would suit this role, and make sure to use evidence from the short story. You may also borrow from our slide deck chart to persuade your readers that this choice would work well in one of these roles. And so please include this initial decision about which major actor today would suit, and it doesn't have to be an actor from today, it could be an actor from the past that would be helpful in portraying one of these characters. That would be choice and sort of based upon that actor's work, based upon the actor's reputation, and even appearance. And by Friday, please include 2 replies, supporting or questioning or identifying what other students select for their particular character. While the interview above does talk about Alice Walker in depth, I'd like to just provide you with a few short pieces on her life. So she was the eighth and youngest child of Willie Lee and Minnie Lou Grant Walker, sharecroppers in Eatonton, Georgia. She did well in school, and she studied at Sarah Lawrence College in New York, where she began her writing career by publishing a book of poetry called Once. And since that time, Walker has published several collections of poetry, novels, volumes of short stories, and Living by the Word, a book of essays. Her best-known novel, The Color Purple, which was from 1982, made her the first Black woman to win the Pulitzer Prize. Some later books are The Temple of My Familiar, 1989, Possessing the Secret of Joy, which is from 1992, Anything We Love Can Be Saved, A Writer's Activism, 1997, and We Are the Ones We Have Been Waiting For, 2006. Finally, The World Will Follow Joy, 2012, and she also has some more recent publications in poetry from 2019-2020. Walker's works express her commitment to the idea of radical social change. She was active in the civil rights movement in Mississippi, where she met and married a civil rights lawyer from whom she separated after the birth of their daughter. In confronting the painful struggle of Black history, Walker asserts that the creativity of Black women, the extent to which they are permitted to express themselves, is a measure of the health of the entire American society. She calls herself a womanist, her term for a feminist of color. In her definition, womanism is preferable to feminism because, as she has said, part of our tradition as Black women is that we are universalists. Black children, yellow children, red children, brown children, that is the Black woman's normal day-to-day relationship. In my family alone, we are about 4 different colors. When a Black woman looks at the world, it is so different. When I look at the people in Iran, they look like kinfolk. When I look at the people in Cuba, they look like my uncles and nieces. Walker credits many writers for influencing her prose style. Virginia Woolf, Zora Neale Hurston, Gabriel Garcia Marquez seem to Walker to be like musicians at one of their cultures and their historical subconscious. Her 2 books of stories show a clear progression of theme. The women in Love and Trouble struggle against injustice almost in spite of themselves, as does the protagonist in Everyday Use. The heroines of You Can't Keep a Good Woman Down consciously challenge conventions. Walker has said, writing really helps you heal yourself. I think if you write long enough, you will be a healthy person. That is, if you write what you need to write, as opposed to what will make money or what will make fame. Everyday Use was first published in Harper's in 1973. I really hope you enjoy this short story for this week, and please let me know if you have any questions as you're reading through, thinking specifically about the development of character.